Jake Turner was a man who had grown used to the quiet of wide-open spaces. His ranch in Montana stretched for miles, with rolling hills, tall grasses swaying in the wind, and a small creek that sparkled under the sunlight. Every morning, he woke to the crowing of roosters and the soft lowing of his cattle, performing the same routines he had followed for years. Jake was strong, skilled, and capable. A man who could handle almost anything life threw at him. But when it came to companionship, he had always felt a deep, unshakable loneliness. Life on the ranch had not been easy. Jake had inherited the land from his father, who had taught him the value of hard work, honesty, and resilience. But with that inheritance came responsibility. Caring for livestock, repairing fences, mending broken tools, and keeping the land thriving left little time for personal connections. Friends and neighbors were kind, but most of them had families of their own, and the few times Jake tried dating, heartbreak had left him cautious. He had learned the hard way that trusting someone too deeply could sometimes lead to disappointment. Despite his solitude, Jake was not unhappy in the simple pleasures of ranch life. He loved the early morning rides through misty fields, the smell of hay mixed with the fresh air, and the quiet that allowed him to think. But still, there were nights when the silence pressed down on him, when he longed for a voice other than his own or the gentle laughter of a companion. He kept these feelings locked away, hidden behind his rugged exterior. Until one day, a rare trip into town awakened a spark he hadn't felt in years. It was a crisp autumn evening when Jake hitched his horse and rode into the small town of Red River. The streets were quiet, with only a few shopkeepers closing their stores for the day. He tied his horse near the saloon and took a deep breath, trying to shake off the weariness of long days on the ranch. Entering the saloon, he was greeted by the warm glow of lanterns and the low murmur of conversations. The smell of fresh bread, coffee, and a hint of wood smoke filled the air. Jake was not used to crowds, and he felt a little out of place. But there was something comforting in the hum of life around him. As he found a seat at the bar, his eyes caught sight of a woman sitting alone at a corner table. She had dark hair tied back loosely, and eyes that seemed to hold stories untold. There was a warmth in her smile, even though it was faint, and she appeared to be quietly observing the room, much like he often did. Jake felt a strange pull, a curiosity that surprised him. It had been so long since he had met someone who made him pause in the middle of a busy day. And here she was, sitting calmly amidst the chatter. Taking a deep breath, Jake walked over and asked if he could join her, but then nodded politely. "Sure," she said, her voice soft but confident. Her name was Clara. She had come to Red River for a short while, helping a distant relative settle into a new home. She wasn't from the town, and she seemed to carry a mixture of excitement and weariness from her travels. Jake introduced himself, and soon, what had started as a polite conversation turned into something lighter, more personal. They talked about simple things at first: the weather, the town, the lives they led. But as the evening wore on, laughter began to fill the spaces between their words. Jake told Clara stories about life on the ranch, how he had once chased a runaway calf across the field, or how he had spent an entire week fixing a broken fence during a storm. Clara shared stories of her own life, tales of city adventures, of small triumphs and occasional disappointments, and Jake found himself drawn to her honesty and her quiet strength. For the first time in a long time, Jake allowed himself to feel something more than just loneliness. The connection was gentle, but undeniable. They shared moments of comfortable silence, where words were unnecessary, and their eyes seemed to speak a language only they could understand. Jake realized that he had been craving companionship, not for romance or passion, but simply for understanding a person who could listen without judgment, who could smile at the quiet moments, who could make the long, empty nights feel less hollow. As the evening turned darker and the saloon began to empty, Jake and Clara found themselves standing outside, looking up at the sky. The stars were bright, scattered across the inky blue, and the cold night air carried the scent of pine and earth. There was a vulnerability in that moment, a shared acknowledgement of the fragility and beauty of life. Jake felt a sudden, fleeting thought, a desire for connection, even if only for one night. It was not a plan born of recklessness, but a human longing for warmth in the midst of isolation. Clara, sensing the subtle change in his demeanor, smiled gently. "Loneliness can feel heavier than it should," she said quietly. "Sometimes it's nice to just share a moment, even if it's brief." Jake nodded, understanding immediately. He wasn't asking for forever, and she wasn't offering it. It was simply a meeting of two solitary hearts, a temporary respite from the isolation they each carried. And yet, even as they agreed to keep things simple, there was a sense of anticipation, of curiosity about what the night might bring. They returned to Jake's ranch that evening, traveling under the starry sky, the silence of the plains surrounding them. Jake felt the weight of his usual caution, but also a sense of excitement he hadn't experienced in years. Clara's presence was comforting, her laughter and quiet observations painting his familiar surroundings in a new light. For the first time, the ranch, usually a place of routine and solitude, felt alive with possibility. As they settled in for the night, they shared stories, music, and small gestures of connection. Jake realized that the heart is not always logical. Even a man who had built walls around himself could find moments of vulnerability when faced with genuine companionship. That night was meant to be simple, fleeting, and uncomplicated. But even in simplicity, there was a spark of understanding, a gentle reminder that human connection, even brief, could awaken feelings long buried. By the time dawn approached, Jake sat by the window, watching the first rays of sunlight touch the fields. He knew that the night had changed something within him. It wasn't just about fleeting companionship, it was a reminder that life, no matter how lonely or isolated, always had room for connection, kindness, and warmth. And even though he had started the night seeking only a temporary reprieve from loneliness, he couldn't help but feel that something deeper might be unfolding, quietly, under the endless Montana sky. The morning sun spilled across the Montana plains in a golden haze, turning the rolling fields into a sea of light. Jake Turner awoke to the soft sound of Clara stirring beside him. For a moment, he just lay there, listening to the quiet rhythm of her breathing and the distant lowing of the cattle. There was a strange warmth in the room, a comfort that he hadn't felt in years. The night before had been different from anything he expected, light-hearted, gentle, and yet somehow meaningful. He had thought it would be simple, a fleeting escape from the loneliness that had become part of his life. But now, in the pale morning light, he realized that it had left a deeper impression on him than he had anticipated. Clara stretched and looked out the window, her eyes following the soft movements of the horses grazing nearby. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "I never get tired of mornings like this." Jake nodded, feeling a quiet sense of pride. The ranch had always been his world, but seeing it through Clara's eyes made it feel fresh, alive, and full of possibility. It was strange, he thought, how one person could change the way you looked at everything around you. Breakfast was simple but satisfying. They cooked eggs and toast over the small stove, the smell of sizzling bacon filling the modest kitchen. Conversation flowed easily, ranging from the mundane weather, chores, and the state of the livestock, to deeper matters. Clara spoke of her own life, of cities she had visited, and the work she had done. Jake listened, fascinated, realizing how little he truly knew of the wider world. She spoke with honesty and humility, never exaggerating her experiences, and he found himself respecting her even more for it. After breakfast, Jake decided to show Clara around the ranch. They walked along the fences, past the fields of grazing cattle, and up a small hill that overlooked the property. The view was breathtaking. Mountains loomed in the distance, their peaks dusted with snow, while the river sparkled in the morning sun. Jake felt a sense of pride as he watched Clara take it all in, her eyes wide with appreciation. "You've built something incredible here," she said. Jake shrugged modestly, brushing a hand through his hair. "It's a lot of work, but it's home," he replied. He didn't mention how lonely it could sometimes feel, or how heavy the responsibility often weighed on him. As they wandered through the fields, Jake noticed how natural Clara seemed in the open air. She wasn't afraid of the animals, and she moved with a quiet confidence that reminded him of the strength it took to survive in the world. They helped feed the horses together, laughing when one of the younger foals nipped at Clara's hand, mistaking it for a treat. Moments like these, small and simple, felt unexpectedly precious to Jake. He had always thought that connection had to be complicated, but now he saw that even ordinary experiences could become meaningful when shared with the right person. By midday, the sun had climbed high, and they paused for a rest under a large oak tree near the creek. Clara pulled out a notebook she had been carrying, filled with sketches of the landscapes she had seen in her travels. Jake watched as she drew, her hand moving skillfully across the page, capturing the essence of the rolling hills and the play of sunlight on the water. He was captivated not just by her talent, but by the quiet focus and care she put into everything she did. It was a reminder that even in a world that sometimes felt harsh and unforgiving, beauty could still be found and appreciated. As the afternoon wore on, they began to speak more openly about their pasts. Jake told Clara about his family, his father, and the years he had spent managing the ranch alone. He spoke of love lost, of friendships that had faded, and of the loneliness that had become a constant companion. Clara listened without judgment, her presence alone providing comfort. Then she shared her own story, a life of movement and change, of searching for something stable and meaningful. She had known loss too, and her honesty created a quiet bond between them. It was strange, Jake thought, how two people could meet so recently and yet feel a connection that seemed to reach far deeper than either of them had expected. As the sun began to lower in the sky, they decided to ride out to the far end of the property. Jake saddled his horse and helped Clara onto hers, adjusting the stirrup carefully. The ride was peaceful, the only sounds the occasional call of a bird or the rustling of the wind through the trees. They spoke little, letting the silence stretch comfortably between them. It was during these quiet moments that Jake realized how much he had missed just being with someone who understood him. Someone who didn't demand anything, but still made him feel alive. By the time they returned to the ranch house, the sky had turned shades of pink and orange, the clouds glowing with the colors of dusk. They sat on the porch, sipping cold lemonade and watching the cattle settle for the evening. Jake felt a sense of calm he hadn't experienced in years. Clara's presence had shifted something in him. He no longer felt the sharp edges of loneliness so acutely. It was not a love story yet, nor did he expect it to be. But there was a bond, subtle and tender, that neither of them could ignore. Dinner that night was quiet but comfortable. They cooked together, sharing small jokes and teasing each other lightly. Jake realized that he was learning new things about Clara every hour, yet he felt he could talk about anything with her without fear of judgment. And Clara, in turn, seemed to appreciate his quiet strength and steady nature, finding comfort in the consistency he offered. For the first time in a long time, Jake felt that he didn't need to hide behind his walls. There was someone here who seemed to understand him. Someone who saw beyond the rugged exterior to the man underneath. After dinner, they sat by the fireplace, the flames casting a warm glow across the room. Clara pulled a blanket around her shoulders, and Jake offered a cup of hot cocoa. They talked about dreams and fears, about the uncertainties of life, and the little joys that made it worthwhile. Jake realized that he had come to the ranch expecting solitude, but now he couldn't imagine facing the world without this connection. He felt a growing respect and admiration for Clara, and even though he tried to tell himself it was only for one night, he couldn't help but hope it might last longer. Night fell completely, and the stars appeared in the clear sky. Jake stepped outside with Clara to look at the constellations, pointing out familiar patterns. They stood side by side, shoulders brushing, enjoying the quiet intimacy that didn't require words. For a long time, they simply watched the night sky, feeling the shared warmth of their presence. Jake understood then that sometimes, life had a way of surprising you. A night meant to be temporary could become a turning point, a chance to open your heart in ways you never expected. As the night deepened, they returned indoors and prepared for bed. Jake thought about the fleeting nature of the night, how it had started as a simple idea, companionship for a few hours, and yet had grown into something more profound. Clara had brought laughter, understanding, and comfort into his life. And he knew that whatever happened next, he would not forget this experience. It had awakened something in him, a willingness to embrace connection, even if it came with uncertainty. They said goodnight with a gentle smile, and as Jake lay in bed, he reflected on the events of the day. Life on the ranch would continue, as it always had, with chores, hard work, and long stretches of quiet. But now, there was a sense of anticipation, a spark that made even the familiar landscape seem new. He didn't know what the future held, nor did he try to predict it. For the first time in years, he simply allowed himself to feel, to hope, to connect, and to trust that sometimes, unexpected encounters could lead to meaningful moments. Jake drifted to sleep thinking of Clara's smile, her quiet strength, and the warmth she had brought into his home. The one-night plan he had thought would be simple and fleeting had already begun to change him. He realized that life had a way of teaching lessons gently, through small gestures and shared experiences. That night, the lonely cowboy discovered that even a brief connection could leave a lasting imprint, opening his heart to the possibility of companionship, trust, and perhaps even love. The following morning dawned cool and bright, with a gentle wind rustling the golden grass of Jake's ranch. Jake had woken before Clara, as he usually did, and had stepped outside to check on the horses. The early sun cast long shadows across the fields, and the air smelled of dew and earth. Normally, he would have felt the familiar comfort of solitude, but this morning was different. Clara's presence lingered in his thoughts like a gentle echo. Her laughter, her curiosity, and the warmth of her company had settled into the corners of his heart in a way that surprised him. He had thought their night together would be fleeting, a brief respite from loneliness, but now he realized it had become something more. When Clara emerged from the house, wrapped in a light shawl and carrying a small notebook, Jake felt a flutter of anticipation. She smiled at him, her eyes reflecting the early sunlight. "Good morning," she said softly. Her voice held a mixture of cheer and hesitation, as though she, too, was aware of the delicate nature of what had begun between them. Jake nodded, offering a quiet morning, and they walked together toward the stables to feed the animals. The day began much like the last simple, peaceful tasks that somehow felt different in Clara's company. Jake showed her how to check the fences for weak spots, how to soothe a skittish horse, and how to ensure the cattle had enough water. Clara followed his instructions carefully, her movements precise and attentive. Jake found himself impressed not only by her willingness to learn, but also by her natural understanding of the rhythms of ranch life. She asked questions, laughed at minor mistakes, and listened carefully to his advice. Every shared task deepened the quiet connection between them. By midday, they had finished the morning chores, and Jake suggested they rest near the creek. Clara pulled a small blanket from her bag, and they settled under the shade of a large willow tree. The creek gurgled softly nearby, reflecting the sunlight in sparkling ripples. For a while, they sat in silence, simply enjoying the serenity. Jake felt a sense of contentment he hadn't known in years. This wasn't just companionship, it was a kind of understanding that only comes from spending time with someone who sees you, truly sees you, and doesn't rush to judge or demand. It was during this quiet that Clara's expression changed, a hint of worry crossing her face. "Jake," she began slowly, "There's something I should tell you." Her tone made him pause. He looked at her, concern flickering in his chest. "What is it?" he asked gently. Clara hesitated, gathering her thoughts. She explained that her visit to Red River was temporary, that she had responsibilities back in the city and could only stay for a short while. There was more to it. She said things she couldn't yet share fully. Personal matters that had brought her here for a brief respite from her usual life. Jake listened quietly, feeling a strange mix of disappointment and understanding. Part of him had hoped that their connection might last longer, but he respected her honesty. "I understand," he said carefully. "I'm glad you told me. Whatever the reason, you're welcome here as long as you want to stay." Clara smiled faintly, relief evident in her eyes. "Thank you, Jake. I appreciate that more than I can say." Despite the underlying tension of uncertainty, the afternoon unfolded gently. They walked through the fields, helping with light repairs and gathering firewood, all the while sharing stories and jokes. Jake noticed how naturally Clara adapted to ranch life, and he admired her resilience and kindness. He began to realize that what had started as a brief encounter was evolving into a real friendship. A bond that went beyond the simplicity of one night. And for the first time in a long time, Jake found himself feeling hope that connection could exist even in unexpected circumstances. Later, as the sun dipped toward the horizon, a sudden challenge arose. One of the younger calves had wandered close to the creek and become stuck in the mud along the bank. Jake immediately sprang into action, moving quickly to free it. Clara rushed to his side, offering steady support and practical suggestions. Together, they managed to coax the calf to safety, both laughing with relief when it finally scrambled free. The experience, though stressful, strengthened their connection. They realized they could rely on each other, not just for conversation, but for practical challenges as well. That evening, as they returned to the ranch house, Jake felt a growing sense of protectiveness toward Clara. He recognized that the emotions he had tried to dismiss as fleeting were becoming genuine concern and care. He also noticed subtle changes in her demeanor, the way she looked at him when she thought he wasn't noticing, the quiet attentiveness in her actions, the warmth that seemed to radiate from her presence. Jake understood that he was beginning to see her not just as a temporary companion, but as someone who had already become important to him. Dinner was quiet but filled with a shared sense of intimacy. They cooked together, working side by side in the small kitchen, sharing small laughs over the simplest tasks. Jake noticed that Clara seemed more relaxed than before, as if the ranch had become a sanctuary for her too. They talked late into the night, about family, dreams, and the small joys that made life meaningful. For the first time, Jake allowed himself to imagine a future beyond his solitary existence. A future that included Clara, at least in some form. As they sat on the porch afterward, watching the stars emerge one by one, Clara's voice broke the comfortable silence. "Jake, I'm glad I met you," she said softly. "Even if I have to leave soon, I feel like I've learned something important being here with you." Jake felt a lump in his throat. "I'm glad you came too," he admitted quietly. "More than I realized at first." There was a pause, a moment when neither spoke, both simply feeling the gravity of the emotions building between them. It was then that the unexpected turn began to reveal itself. A letter arrived, delivered by a town courier who had come to the ranch unexpectedly. Clara opened it with a nervous hand. Her face changed as she read the words, a mixture of concern and determination crossing her features. She explained to Jake that it was from her family, a message that required her immediate attention. She needed to leave Red River sooner than anticipated. The brief time she had planned to stay had been shortened, and the decision weighed heavily on her. Jake felt a pang of disappointment but hid it behind a steady expression. He didn't want to make her feel guilty for circumstances beyond her control. Clara prepared for her departure the next morning. She packed her belongings with care, making sure everything was in order. Jake helped her, feeling an unfamiliar tension in his chest. He realized that he had grown attached to her in ways he hadn't expected. Her presence had become part of the rhythm of his days, the laughter during chores, the shared quiet moments by the creek, the gentle conversations at night. The thought of her leaving brought a strange emptiness, a reminder of just how deeply human connection could touch even the loneliest heart. Before she left, they stood together at the edge of the ranch, looking out over the fields bathed in moonlight. Clara turned to him, her eyes glistening. "Jake, thank you for everything. I came here thinking it would just be a night, maybe a brief escape. But you've given me something more than I expected. I'll never forget it." Jake nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "Neither will I," he said simply. "Even if it's just a moment in time, it meant more than I can say." They embraced briefly, a gesture full of warmth and sincerity. It was not a romantic gesture born of passion, but one born of respect, understanding, and genuine care. They parted with a quiet promise to stay in touch, though neither knew what the future held. As Clara rode off toward the town, Jake watched her go, feeling the weight of absence already settling in. But beneath the sadness, there was also a quiet gratitude. Life had a way of surprising him, teaching lessons gently, through moments both fleeting and profound. That night, Jake sat by the fireplace, reflecting on the events of the past days. He understood now that what had started as a simple idea, a night of companionship, had evolved into something far more meaningful. Clara had awakened emotions he had long suppressed, reminding him that connection could be unexpected, temporary, and yet deeply impactful. He realized that love, in its many forms, did not always follow plans or expectations. Sometimes, it appeared briefly, teaching lessons and leaving impressions that would last a lifetime. Jake knew that the days ahead would be quieter, the ranch still his own domain. Yet, something within him had shifted. He was no longer just a lonely cowboy, isolated in routine and solitude. He had experienced warmth, understanding, and companionship. And even though the future was uncertain, he carried with him a new awareness that life's most meaningful connections often came when least expected, and that even a single, fleeting encounter could leave a lasting mark on the heart. As he looked out over the moonlit fields, Jake felt a renewed sense of purpose. He would continue his work on the ranch, but he would also carry with him the memory of Clara, the laughter, the quiet conversations, and the unspoken bond they had shared. Life was unpredictable, yes, but it was also full of possibilities. And sometimes, the most unexpected turns revealed truths far more powerful than any plan could foresee. The days following Clara's departure were quieter than Jake had anticipated. The ranch felt emptier, the winds through the fields colder, and even the animals seemed to echo his solitude in their low, gentle noises. Jake had thought he was used to the loneliness, that his routines and the wide-open spaces were enough to fill his life. But now, the absence of Clara's laughter, her curious questions, and the warmth she brought left a subtle ache in his chest. It was a quiet reminder that sometimes, even a brief connection could change the way a person saw the world. Jake returned to his usual routines with a thoughtful mind. He rose early to feed the cattle, repaired fences along the far edges of the ranch, and tended to the horses with careful attention. Yet, while the work kept him occupied, his thoughts often drifted to Clara. He remembered the way her eyes had sparkled in the sunlight, the gentle sound of her voice, and the way she had moved confidently among the animals. Every memory, small or large, reminded him that her visit had left more than just a passing impression. It had touched something deep inside him, a reminder of connection, kindness, and warmth that he had long forgotten. He also began to realize that he wanted to keep that connection alive, even from a distance. Jake wrote a letter, something he hadn't done in years, carefully choosing his words. He told Clara how much he appreciated her presence, how her visit had changed his days, and how he hoped she would find joy and comfort wherever she went. He didn't rush to send it, waiting instead for the right moment, reflecting on the value of expressing feelings honestly and with care. The act of writing the letter itself gave him a sense of peace, a feeling that he was doing something meaningful rather than letting the memory fade. Weeks passed, and life on the ranch gradually returned to its familiar rhythm. The work was demanding, as always, and the solitude that had once been comforting now sometimes felt heavy. Jake found himself watching the horizon more often, imagining Clara riding toward him across the fields, or sharing her thoughts and laughter in the quiet evenings. Each time he thought of her, he realized how much her brief stay had affected him. It was no longer about loneliness, it was about realizing that human connection, even temporary, had the power to transform a person's life. Then, one crisp autumn morning, a familiar figure appeared at the edge of the property. Jake was checking the fences near the creek when he saw Clara approaching on horseback. His heart leapt unexpectedly, a mixture of surprise, joy, and relief washing over him. Clara waved, a warm smile on her face, and quickened her pace as she reached the fence. "Jake," she called, her voice carrying across the open fields. Jake dropped the tools he was holding and ran toward her, his boots crunching on the gravel. Clara dismounted gracefully, and they embraced. The hug was long and sincere, filled with the unspoken understanding of everything they had shared and everything they had missed. Jake stepped back slightly, holding her hands in his. "I wasn't sure I'd see you again," he admitted, his voice soft. Clara shook her head, smiling. "I had to come back. There was no way I could stay away after everything we shared." For a moment, the world around them seemed to stand still, the rolling hills, the golden fields, the quiet creek, and it felt as though nothing else mattered but this reunion. They spent the morning catching up, talking about the weeks that had passed. Clara shared stories of her work and the responsibilities that had taken her away, while Jake told her about life on the ranch, the challenges he had faced, and the quiet moments he had spent thinking of her. Each word, each gesture, reinforced the bond that had begun weeks earlier. It became clear that what had started as a fleeting encounter was evolving into something far more meaningful, something that neither of them could ignore. By midday, they decided to ride through the fields together. Jake saddled his horse and helped Clara onto hers, just as he had done when she first arrived. They rode side by side, the wind carrying their laughter across the plains. The simple act of riding together felt familiar, comforting, and yet entirely new. Jake realized that this shared experience, the trust, the cooperation, and the joy of being together, was more important than any plan or expectation. It was real, and it was theirs. Later, they stopped near the creek for a picnic, laying out a simple meal of bread, cheese, and fresh fruit. They laughed at small jokes, shared memories from their first meeting, and spoke honestly about their feelings. Clara confessed that she had thought of him every day, missing the calm and steady presence he had brought to her life. Jake admitted that he had felt the same, and that her return had reminded him that life could offer second chances, that connection could grow even stronger when nurtured with patience and care. As the afternoon faded into evening, they returned to the ranch house. Jake suggested they sit on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange, pink, and gold. It was a breathtaking sight, and Clara leaned against him, resting her head on his shoulder. For the first time, Jake allowed himself to believe that the future might hold more than solitude and routine. He could imagine days filled with shared laughter, quiet conversations, and the simple joys of companionship. Dinner that evening was another opportunity for connection. They cooked together, sharing tasks and teasing one another over small mistakes. Jake realized that the mundane, everyday chores of life could become meaningful when shared with someone who mattered. Clara's presence turned ordinary moments into treasured memories, and Jake felt a deep sense of gratitude for the bond they were building. He began to understand that love and companionship were not always about grand gestures, they were about the small, consistent ways people show care, support, and understanding. As night fell, they sat by the fireplace, wrapped in a shared blanket. The flames flickered softly, casting a warm glow over the room. Clara rested her hand on Jake's, and he felt a sense of completeness that he had never experienced before. They spoke of dreams for the future, of places they wanted to explore, and of the simple joys they hoped to share on the ranch. There was no rush, no pressure, just the quiet assurance that they had found something rare and valuable in one another. In the days that followed, their bond continued to grow. Clara helped Jake with the ranch, learning more about the animals, the land, and the responsibilities that came with it. Jake, in turn, learned more about her world, her thoughts, and her dreams. They supported each other in practical ways, but also emotionally, providing comfort, encouragement, and understanding. Life on the ranch, once a solitary routine, became richer, more vibrant, and filled with shared purpose. Jake realized that the experience had taught him something profound. He had come to the idea of a fleeting night of companionship with caution, thinking it would be simple and temporary. But through honesty, patience, and shared experience, it had become far more than that. He had learned that meaningful connections could arise unexpectedly, that trust and understanding could form quickly when nurtured with care, and that even brief encounters had the power to transform lives. Clara, too, felt the change. She had arrived at the ranch, seeking a temporary escape from her life, a brief respite from responsibilities and solitude. Yet, she had found a place where she could be herself, where she could laugh, share, and connect in a way that brought deep satisfaction. She realized that sometimes the people we meet unexpectedly become the ones who shape our lives in the most meaningful ways. Together, they decided to make a life on the ranch not just as temporary companions, but as partners. Jake recognized that love was not about grand plans or perfection, but about commitment, respect, and the willingness to share both ordinary and extraordinary moments. Clara understood that true connection required patience, understanding, and a readiness to embrace the unexpected turns of life. Seasons changed. The fields ripened with crops, and the animals grew and thrived under their shared care. The ranch, once a symbol of solitude, became a home filled with laughter, warmth, and companionship. Jake and Clara built routines together, celebrated small victories, and supported each other through challenges. Every day, they discovered new ways to appreciate one another, deepening their bond and creating a shared life that was richer than either had imagined. Looking back, Jake often reflected on the night he had thought would be fleeting, a night that had seemed simple and temporary. It had brought Clara into his life, and in doing so, had taught him the value of openness, trust, and human connection. He realized that life's most meaningful moments often arrived unexpectedly, disguised as ordinary experiences or brief encounters. And sometimes, those moments had the power to change the course of a life forever. Years later, when he looked out over the golden fields of his ranch, Jake no longer saw solitude. He saw a shared life, one filled with laughter, understanding, and the quiet joy of knowing that even the loneliest hearts could find companionship when least expected. And every time he saw Clara's smile or heard her gentle laughter, he was reminded that life's unexpected turns could lead to the truest, most enduring connections. In the end, the lonely cowboy who had once sought a fleeting companion discovered something far greater than he had ever imagined. A partner, a friend, and a love that grew from patience, honesty, and shared moments. The night that had begun as a simple idea had transformed into a lifetime of memories, proving that the heart's deepest desires often find their way when we least expect them.